This is Bar Crawl Radio. We're recording at Gephardt's Beer Culture Bar on West 72nd Street in Manhattan. We're at the end of the summer of 2019. Today, we're going to explore two men's stories. One a father, the other a son.
David Hersch was a survivor of KZ Mauthausen, a World War II Nazi concentration camp in Austria. A man with a pleasant disposition, David Hersch, as a teen, survived the horrors of Nazi camps. Then, as American forces descended into Nazi territory, David Hersch escaped 2 death marches, the only person to have done so.
Today on Bar Crawl Radio, we're talking with Jack Hersch, who wrote a book about his father's experiences and why this story has haunted him throughout his life and the questions he needed to answer. Jack Hersch is David's son. He wrote Death March Escape, the remarkable story of a man who escaped the Nazi Holocaust. Jack is clearly a writer of some talent, but his day job is as a strategic advisor to investment institutions and corporate managements. He has served as corporate board member and has guest lectured in the business schools of M.I.T, U.S.C, and U.S.C. Berkeley. And just recently we learned he's now teaching at Touro College, Intro to Finance and Real Estate. And he lives, in fact, in New York City.
Also, Jack Hersch is a pilot who flies acrobatic planes.
Aerobatic planes.
Aerobatic.
Yes.
Aerobatic planes.
Oh, that's not acrobatic.
That's
you wrote
right.
acrobatic.
I wrote
So aerobatic.
No,
What is an aerobatic
I wrote
plane?
aerobatic.
No, that's a C there, honey.
Oh, I wrote acrobatic.
It's an airplane that goes upside down, does loops, does
Well,
rolls.
it does acrobats, though.
There's acrobatic stuff,
Are
but when you
called
do it in the air,
It's
it's
aerobatics. Okay.
Do you still do that?
I do, but not as often as I'd like.
Can we go sometime?
That's scary. No, you.
Yeah, do you ever take a passenger with you?
No.
No.
I have, in fact, the friends I've taken up say, "Promise me you won't turn us upside down." I go, "Yeah." Okay.
Oh, wow. So it's like a Cessna or a...
Well, actually, there is a Cessna that can do it, but no, it's things like the Extra or the Pitts or Stearman. They're planes.
I don't know exactly what
Are
you're
they
talking
prop
about.
planes?
They are prop planes, but I've flown jet fighters too.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
Amazing. Okay.
I don't think we have to
It's not what
change.
it's
I
not
don't
what
think we
we-
have to take that out.
No, I like that. It's all
We-
good stuff.
Yeah. So he earned a second-degree black belt in...
Gayo, Rayo, Karate.
I said Ryu.
it's Goju Ryu. It's just,
Ryu, okay.
It's just Ryu.
I had a student named Ryu, R-Y-U. And-
Yeah, no, I think maybe it's Americanized. It's Ryu. Just
Goju Ryu.
Goju Ryu.
Okay.
So that's not the thing where you cut the wood in half with your hand, or?
Well, that's more traditional Korean type, and some of the harder Japanese
Like
styles.
Taekwondo.
We happen not to do that. We didn't do board breaking, but they're all the same. In the end of the day, they're kick, block, punch.
Right.
They're the Korean, the Japanese, and the Chinese forms are somewhat different, and
Right.
you learn what the differences are. But at the end of the day, kick, block, punch.
Okay.
Sounds like a whole other show.
So wait, it's
could-
more. There's more.
There's more. I know.
He's
Jack has done more.
He's a long-distance cyclist and ice hockey player. He plays tennis at a competitive level and ran 5 marathons. And my
Oh,
partner here tells me that you ran the last one on a broken Achilles.
a torn something.
I tore a muscle.
tore.
The last 7 miles, I tore a muscle in my calf.
In your calf, okay.
Actually, my first marathon with 7 miles to go. And I met some friends who were going to, what's called banditing. They were going to bandit me, and they looked at me like, "Why am I limping?" And I said, "Because I just tore my calf muscle."
Oh, you knew that's what you had done.
Yeah, and I heard it pop, and they said, "Well, does it hurt when you walk?" I said, "It's killing me." And they said, "Well, does it hurt when you run?" And I said, "Yeah, it's killing me." They said, "Well, if it hurts when you walk and you hurt when you run, you just might as well run." And
Right.
so I
That's
did, and
funny.
honestly, and I actually talk about it in the book, I channeled my
Yeah, you
father
told me.
the entire way
Yeah.
through.
Right,
It's
right.
like, if he
And-
could do it, I could do it.
Yeah.
And of course, we're going to be
Wow.
talking about your father and your relationship and his early life. So
So Jack, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
There are many children of Nazi Holocaust. There are many children of Nazi Holocaust survivors, but few have spent time discovering their parents' past. You dedicated a lot of time into researching, traveling, and interviewing experts to uncover how your father beat death by the Nazi killing machines.
I did, yes.
Why did you write this book?
Well, why I researched the book and why I wrote the book are sort of two different questions. It started with the research. I was triggered. My interest was triggered. I knew my father's story my entire life. He told it every Passover. We were Orthodox, so he told it twice on Passover, the 2 nights of the Seder. The Seder is the story of the Jews escaping from Egypt in the dead of night, and my father would digress to tell his story of escaping from concentration camp twice. So I knew it. But what I didn't know until 2007 was that he was somewhat famous in the concentration camp. In Mauthausen became a museum. It was not a well-known concentration camp because very few Jews were actually kept there, and so very few Jews were killed there. But it was the single worst concentration camp in the Reich. It was self-rated by the Nazis as the worst. The Austrian government had turned it into a museum. A few years before I discovered my father's photo, or a few years before my cousin discovered my father's photo on the internet, they had posted it up there along with a caption saying he'd been found by a local Austrian family and hidden until the end of the war. My cousin happened to be searching for something for her mother, turns this up, calls me up 6 years after my father died.
This is your cousin who lives in Israel?
My cousin lives in Israel, yes.
Yeah.
So 6 years after my father died, she calls me up and says, we're very close, she calls me up and she says, "You're never going to believe this, your father's on the internet, go Google him." And this photo turns up with the caption. I didn't even know Mauthausen had an internet, a website. So
and you hadn't gone to it yourself. It was your cousin who went to it and said, "Take a look at this."
Correct. My cousin found it on the internet just coincidentally, and says, "You got to look at this. Here's a picture of your dad." And then I don't have the photo, so I reach out to the concentration camp. Who are you guys? Why do you have my dad's photo? How do you know his story? That led to years of discovering all this extra information about the story. I knew the story. My father was a really interesting, engaging guy, and he told it in an interesting and engaging way. Now, there's something certainly interesting, but nothing engaging about spending a year working as a slave, as a laborer in a concentration camp. But somehow my father made it that way. And now I spent years working with historians to learn what really had happened to him, his story, but without the embellishment, without the story behind the story is exactly right. And then a few years after I started, I got on a plane and I went there.
Yep.
Many years after I started, I got on a plane and I went there, and by that point they knew what the Death March route was. When I started in 2007, they didn't even know what the Death March route was from Mauthausen to, it was a 34-mile route to a camp called Gunskirchen. That's where he escaped from twice. They didn't know what the route was in 2007. By the time I went in 2016, they knew.
The people that were there,
the historians, the people running the memorial,
who were enormously interested in it.
Hugely. Well, there was a subtext to it, which actually goes into that initial question you asked me why I wrote the book. The Austrian government had spent many years. Denial is not the right word, but trying to downplay their role in World War II. They were victims, and they certainly were victims, but they were also not completely victims.
Right.
And so they felt that
they were compliant.
They were somewhat compliant, and so the governments had never quite known what to do with Mauthausen. The worst camp in the Reich, and it's right in their territory. It's 15, 20 miles.
And I wonder how many people
border.
have heard of Mauthausen. I mean, we hear of Auschwitz and Birkenau.
Well, that's right, because it was not really a camp for Jews. It was a labor camp. It was very much like Auschwitz, the labor camp, not Auschwitz II, or otherwise known as Birkenau,
so
the death camp.
Who was sent there?
Political prisoners, incorrigible POWs, communists, gypsies, gays, people they didn't want, political prisoners, Russian prisoners of war were sent there. It was a rock one. It was a working mine, and the point of it was to work to death these people they wanted dead anyway, but they might as well get something out of them.
I want to kind of get also the other part of this story, which is your relationship with your father.
Sure.
And as we go along, I want to hear more of the details of your investigation, and we also want to hear about some details about Mauthausen.
Yeah, of course.
And the other was it Gilson? Goosen.
Goosen
1 and 2, right.
But he hasn't answered yet why he wrote the book.
Yeah,
right.
but I think we can get to that.
Well,
I think we're going to
the
get
question.
to that.
Yeah, so the short answer to why I wrote the book is because in my research, I realized I had a story to tell. The reason why I did the research was because I realized the story my father told me was not quite the full picture.
Right. And there was some yearning there too.
Very much.
Right.
Look, I was very close to my dad. I loved him like I can't describe. And to realize, well, he went and visited the camp in 1997. He died in 2001. He never told me he went. But my cousin knew because my cousin's mother, my father's sister knew.
Yeah.
My aunt, right.
Knew that he had revisited the camps after, 50 years?
Well, 1945 was when he was liberated, and this was
1997.
Right, so 42 years, 43 years, 42 years.
50.
50.
50, yeah.
Yeah.
What do I do
Says
for a
the
living?
You're in high finance.
What do I do for a living? 50, that's right. Thank you. Well, we're doing this in a bar.
Yeah, okay.
No
Am I blushing? Can you see?
No, you're getting drunk from your water and lemon there.
Clearly. So anyway, yes, 50-something years, and he went back. And he didn't tell me he went. And I thought he told me everything. And so what was the big secret? What did he...
Right.
And it took an entire decade of research to discover what the secret was, and it wasn't in the end such a huge secret.
All right, let's not get to the secret.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Let's kind of
Good.
build to that.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Your father, David Hersch,
Yeah.
told his story, as you said, each year around at the Passover Seder.
Right.
Right. I mean, from my perspective, I'm Jewish. This is indeed the Passover story.
Yeah.
The march.
No question about it. It is escaping from tyranny.
Yep.
And my father did it twice.
Yep.
And as I tell people, if you escaped twice from the Nazis, you'd be telling people. And so he enjoyed. He was not like most survivors. The typical image you have, I believe, you have as a survivor. Certainly, the image that the popular press, the movies, Schindler's List, that shows you at the end of the movie.
I'm not crazy about that movie.
Morose.
Yes.
They don't smile. They don't crack a joke.
Right.
They haven't laughed since 1945 or 1943 or whenever they were sent to the camps. My father was nothing like that. He was a funny, interesting, engaging, good-looking,
Friendly.
or as his friends used to say, "Yeah, your father's good-looking. Just ask him." He was. I mean, look at the photo, that headshot photo that was on the internet. That he was a good-looking guy, and he knew it. But he was the life of the party kind of guy, and he was so much unlike any other survivor. And I didn't know. I mean, his friends were the same way. They were interesting and funny and engaging too. So this is all I knew about survivors. And when I realized, back to the question about why I wrote the book, another reason was when I came to realize what the rest of the world believes survivors are all about, and my father was nothing like that, I needed to tell the world, wait a minute, some of these guys were pretty ordinary. They had a horrific year or two or three, and then they did everything in their power, some of them, to be as normal as they could possibly be. And they put those demons as far back down as they could, and it would come out at night.
They didn't talk
and it would
about
come out. My father had plenty of demons, and he had trouble sleeping plenty of times. But the guy you knew, the guy at dinner, was not that guy.
Right. And at the end of your book, we're going to have you read a piece of it before we leave here.
Uh-huh.
You kind of bring all that together, and I think you do it beautifully. I was just I had read all through the whole thing. Becky hadn't quite got through the whole thing, and I said, you got to hear this ending that kind of brings everything together. But what I wanted to ask was that there was one Seder, the last Seder, that you had with him, was you and him.
Yes.
It wasn't the family.
Correct.
Amazing. I mean, I see the scene in the movie, right?
It was a lucky coincidence.
But he invited you. It was like a command performance. It's like he said, "You're going to come, and I'm going to tell you this."
I was living in San Diego. We had our Seder plans for San Diego. My father lived in Long Beach, Long Island. He needed heart surgery, and a few weeks before the Seder, he said, "Hey, do you want to come for Seder?" I hadn't been there, and I'm guessing around a decade. I mean, I moved out of the house. I have a family. I've got kids. I've got whatever I've got. And it just wasn't on the radar. And he was so Orthodox. He wasn't flying out. Seders for us were not what they are for many people in America. These big, huge communal family gatherings. It was for my family as an adult with kids. We had neighbors and friends, Jewish and not Jewish. Not when I was growing up. It was a traditional Seder, just the family, 3 hours long. Follow the Haggadah, the book that you were supposed to follow.
Right, yeah.
Including your father telling the story.
Including my father telling the story.
Of his exodus.
Absolutely, of his own exodus and the Jews' exodus. And all of a sudden he says, "Can you come out?" And I'm like, God, bells are going off. This isn't normal. And what it really was all about, he had surgery coming up, and he just wanted his oldest son there. He knew his younger son, my brother, 4 years younger than me, wasn't going to come. He had a family of his own, not far away, but again, it wasn't a question. He wasn't going to invite my dad, and my dad wasn't going to invite him, because that was never going to be able to happen religiously. That's all.
Yeah, yeah. What was the feeling when he said, Jackala?
Yeah.
That's what he's called you in the book.
Yeah. In life.
In life, yeah. Come out here.
It was a combination of, what a great idea. I mean, why didn't I think of this? Because I really only did one major Seder the first night, because we weren't as religious as we were originally. But it was also, as I said, bells kind of went off. There was something going on. There was a reason why he wanted me, and I figured I'd find it out when I got there.
Yeah. And I think you did, maybe not that night, but in the ensuing nights when you were doing your research. We can't get to everything that's in this book. It's an amazing book.
I'm just curious, though, when you would read when he would tell the story, would you listen raptly, or would you in any way be like
this
okay,
is what Dad does this all the time?
This already?
Yeah.
No, it was rapt attention. He was. It was never lost on me how profound his experience was.
Right.
It was lost on me because of the way he told it, how horrific it was. Mm-hmm. It seemed, I'm not going to describe it as summer camp, but it didn't seem quite as death-defyingly ominous as when I then went to the camp and stood in front of the building that he worked in for 7-8 months.
Do you think that maybe if he told you all the true story, that it would have made it that much more true for him in a way, or did he want to downplay it because he didn't want you guys to have to understand that kind of?
I think it's both. I think one, he didn't want to have to go there. He was perfectly happy remembering it in his engaging way.
And it wasn't a heroic story.
But he was entertaining himself. This is as deep as I'm going to go. He was nearly beaten to death, and he would chuckle about it a little bit. Oh, you should have seen how they beat me. Yeah, okay, that sounds hysterical, Dad. But then
you didn't at the moment of him telling this, you didn't explore it. And what I got from the book is your desire to say, well, why didn't I ask him more? You hit it on the head. That stayed with me from the minute I saw his photo on the internet. Why didn't I ever? He was here. I had him. Now I don't.
But in my conversations I've had with people about my book, I've ran into other second and third generation survivors, not only of the Holocaust, but of other incidences of people. Right. I was in Pittsburgh, and people whose fathers served in combat units in Vietnam or World War II. Would say to me that they never said a word about it, and I never asked about it. There was some. It
was my father like that.
Yeah. Okay. So
I didn't ask.
There's some wall that, as a kid, I think as a child, you say I can't penetrate this wall because I'm not being invited to penetrate it,
right.
or whatever the reason might be. I just didn't do it, and then I really regretted it. And when I speak to people, I tell people, if your parents are still alive, start digging now while they can answer your questions, because it's so much harder later. Let's
get to a little bit of the story. It is fascinating. We can't get to all of it.
Sure.
It's the last year of the war, 1944. The war ended in 45, right? Your father's family was working in Austria,
Hungary.
Hungary, right? And in 1944, the Nazis decided to round up the Hungarian Jews. They had a soap factory, so they were doing okay. What happened to them?
So, before the spring of 1944, their lives really were not especially different than it was before the Nazis came in. The Nazis didn't really come into Hungary in a big way because the Hungarian region who ran the country didn't allow them. And as long as he towed the line with the Nazis, they were kind of okay with it. But by early 1944, he was planning to leave the Nazi fold, and then so the Nazis and Adolf Eichmann and company came in a big way that late winter, early spring. And at that point, my father's life really changed. He had been attached to something called a labor battalion, where once a week, he was 16, 17 years old, lived at home. Once a week, he had to clean streets and parks, and not just him, other Jews, other communists and intellectuals and people that they just wanted to put in these battalions. His brother, a few years older, had been shipped away to a battalion that was working in the countryside. I don't even know where, but closer to the Russian border, or the Russian army that was approaching, I should say. And so that was, other than service in the labor battalion, that was the only real impact. May 3rd, 1944, overnight, he and his family are ordered into a ghetto.
Yeah, describe that ghetto, because it's not the kind of ghetto that we think of like Warsaw ghetto.
Exactly
no
right.
streets.
You hear the word ghetto, you think of the Warsaw ghetto. Maybe you think of the Venice ghetto, which, if you've been to Venice, you discover they have it. No, this was a field in a forest, and I've been there. It is a few acres, trees. They gave them wood and canvas and said, knock yourselves out.
So there's no water, there's no sewage.
There's no nothing.
They were camping.
They're essentially
There's
camping.
no stores or anything. It's just out in the forest someplace.
For 7,000 odd people.
Oh my
And
God!
they had to forage.
And they had. I don't know what their lives were food-wise, whether or not they were given food or had to. I just never investigated and couldn't find anything in the digging that I did do. But they had to live there for what turned out to be about a month. And that was actually my father's first big break. A few days into it, they were looking for a baker. And my father said, he's a baker.
This guy has nerve.
My father had huge nerve. And my father had turned out he'd had a friend whose family were bakers. Maybe they were already pressed into service somewhere because he wasn't in the picture, this guy, is the friend. My father said, I'm a baker. And he
knew nothing about baking.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, he hung around his mom, right? Whatever she did. But he turned into be a decent baker, and they let him live in town and had 3 German soldiers working for him.
Wow.
At all of 17 years old, or 18 at that point.
So, KZ Mauthausen has been called the most brutal of the Nazi concentration camps.
Yes.
What did you learn about KZ Mauthausen
So
and the auxiliary camps?
KZ
Mauthausen and the auxiliary camps Gusen 1 and 2. What were these places like?
Eventually he was transferred there.
Well, so Mauthausen is not only the main camp. It tends to be the one that people know the best. It had something like 40 subcamps. The subcamps were all administered and run by Mauthausen, and many people who stayed at the subcamps, names you never heard of, would just say they were at Mauthausen. It's just like a satellite office a block away. So Mauthausen was a granite mine, purposely built right along a tremendous rock wall that they were mining for granite, for road beds and for railroad track beds and for building facades. Gusen was 2.5 miles away, a little bit downhill, a little bit to the west. Also, a series of rock mines by a town called Gusen, and they built a concentration camp administered by Mauthausen, and that was where they sent my father. My father's arrival in Mauthausen, he took a shower there. They signed him in there, and they shipped him up 2 miles down to this satellite camp of theirs. It's just like, a different barracks run by the same administration. So Mauthausen is there today, and so walking around there, you can see barracks, you can see administrative buildings, there's a museum there. It is a remarkable site, but for me, not quite as remarkable as Gusen, because Gusen was where my father physically worked.
Right.
And the building that he worked in, it was called the
Stone Crusher.
Thank you. The building my father worked in, the Stone Crusher, is still there. It is part of a working rock granite mill, not a mine anymore. The mine, at least they're not running. But they're running it as a mill, and the guy who owns it...
The same stone crusher that the Nazis were running is
the same crusher. The building is there, but the building no longer has any function. It's empty.
Yeah.
And it was partially... It was a trio of buildings. There's a photo in the book.
Yeah.
The outlying building about 30 feet away is gone, but a pair of buildings connected, a storage building and what turned out to be the loading building for the mine, for the crusher, are still there. It's on the property of this granite mill, and it's owned by a family called Porschacker, who's the guy who runs it is around my age, studied at the University of Arizona, a perfectly nice guy. They didn't own it during the war. They have no culpability in this whatsoever, but it's sitting there.
Yep.
in this working
It
rock.
seems strange, though, that it would still be in operation.
It sounds incredible to me. In Mauthausen itself, their rock mine is a memorial, and you can go there and you can walk around it, and it is not working. But this is this Porschacher mill in Gusen is operating, and I just heard it's up for sale now. And there's a possibility the government may buy it and turn it into a memorial. And
Well, they're serious about this.
They're very serious, and I'm going to credit my book for it. The historians tell me that the publicity that helped, that was generated in part by the book, but in part also by the efforts that these historians have made, are beginning to make headway, and they might really turn it into a memorial finally.
You know, the horror of Mauthausen and Gulsen 2, and then Gusen
2 and 1,
which was even worse. You had found out, and you describe in your book. What I want to do is kind of get to a little bit of the horror of this.
Sure,
if we can get to it. I mean, I think jumping into the book, you kind of get lost, like in any book you can get. And this is really nicely written. I mean, it's well written and well described.
Thank you.
You describe in your book the various people who inhabited this hellholes. Who were the prisoners in KZ Mauthausen? They were not all Jews, and we talked about that. But there were also guards and capos who were Jews or other prisoners who were capos. Who were, and these people seem to be quite gruesome.
The guards were all SS, right?
Yeah.
So you volunteered for the SS. You pledged your allegiance to Adolf Hitler. You were the worst of the worst. You believed everything.
Well, you didn't think you were the worst of the worst.
But now looking at it from our view, certainly. Listen, if you believe that the only right and true humans are Aryans, well, I think I'll call you the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
No, we get it.
I agree with you.
I'm happy to do that. But so in the camp, the prisoners, both in Gusen 1, Gusen 2, and Mauthausen, were for the most part political prisoners, incorrigible POWs, communists, gays, gypsies. Jews were only sent there in the spring of 1944 with the Hungarian Jews being deported to camps because they literally were running out of people to kill. I mean, they couldn't. The point of Mauthausen and Gusen was to work you to death. In fact, most people who were sent there, and although interestingly, just as a digression, so not only did they have a rock mine there, but around Gusen they had factories. They had a Messerschmitt factory. They had chemical factories. And so in some cases, there were very high-level experts, prisoners, who were working there, people with great skills. They could starve them within an inch of their lives, but they couldn't kill them because they needed these people.
And when they got ill, they would take them to the hospital and pull them back to life.
Hospitals and infirmaries for just that reason. They couldn't have these people die on them, but they didn't have to feed them very much. They could treat them like garbage. And so my father, who was simply working in a rock mine, he was in the category of people they were perfectly happy to kill them. But the problem with most of the people they were happy to kill, they were running out of these people. So they had to start sending Jews there. So Jews don't know much about this camp and weren't sent there in any significant numbers until the middle of 1944. Very late in the war.
And yet, though the product was death,
yes,
in essence, the product was also granite.
It was granite
because the granite was actually used for building stuff.
Hitler needed granite to create the Thousand-Year Reich. You know, there's no more interestingly edifice building than a granite building.
So make sense about, I want granite, and I've got these workers, and I want to kill them.
It's perfect. I've got to get the granite, and I've got to kill these people anyway. I might as well get something out of them before they die. Perfect. That's how they thought about it. And
there's enough of them, we can kill them, and they can do the work, and we can kill them.
Well, they believed there was enough of them in 1938, but by 1944 they were running out of them. And in fact, the prisoner personnel cards, of which I have my father's is in the book, most of the prisoners who were sent there, their prisoner personnel cards said, "Return not desired." And so the capos, there were no Jews who were capos. I mean, in some of the camps, Jews were elevated. Capos were essentially, it comes from, nobody actually knows where the word comes from, but if you know the mafia has capos or captains.
There you go.
So they're sort of intermediate level people.
Right.
They were not Germans. I mean, they may have been Germans. They were not allied with the administration of the camp or the SS. They were prisoners themselves, but they were given authority. They might have run a bunk. They may have run a work group, which were a group that worked in the stone crusher. They were called commandos. So they may have run a commando.
So a commando is a
it's a group. It's simply a group.
It's a group of people doing a certain kind of work.
It's like the British use of the word commandos for. In fact, it's where the word commando for the military comes from, because the British would call a group of soldiers a commando.
Okay. So you emphasize in the book that death was always present, including in the work they were forced to do. Can we explore some of David's experiences of his work details, which he called commandos?
Sure. So, when he first arrived in Mauthausen, when we sent off to Gusen, his first attempt at how he was going to get his way through this concentration camp was he said he was a carpenter. He probably was not a baker. He certainly was not a carpenter. And yet they took him. He spent a day or so, I don't know, he said it was a day in the carpentry commando. They figured out he wasn't a carpenter. Don't have any idea why they didn't kill him for the ruse. But they put him in the what was called the Kostenhof Commando, because the name of the mine, the granite mine, was called Kostenhof. So my father then was moved to the Kostenhof Commando, and his job was simply, when granite was dynamited, you had now anything from 2-pound to 200-pound pieces of granite, and he and the other prisoners had to move them to a central depot. Then from the depot it would be sent to the stone crusher. He was part of that process. After 30 days. He was moved to Gusen 1. He was originally in Gusen 2. Gusen 1, he was sent to a commando whose job it was to load mine carts, push them about 200 yards, and unload them into the building that housed the stone crusher itself. And in his view, it was not particularly horrific work. It was non-stop work, which he really didn't like. His first commando, where he was working on the rock wall, he got breaks when they were doing dynamiting. In this case, it was nonstop, but at least it was work. It was consistent. He knew what was expected of him. The compos, he said, were not especially horrific, although one nearly beat him to death at some point. But then again, this is the difference between my father telling it and my memory of it, and now you asking me about it. They were really nice and sweet, although they nearly beat him to death. Okay, so
right.
But he survived. In his telling, he survived there right the way until about November of 1944. So let's call it 6 months in total working in this area.
And then he lost 80 pounds.
By the end of the war, he had lost 80 pounds. At this point, he's probably down 60, right?
Okay.
Right, exactly. When he starts at 160 or 150, he was a kid. And then he was sent to the infirmary. And he tells the story of going to the infirmary in a sort of funny way. But having read the book, you know that when he was sent to the infirmary, he was put into a room called the Bahnhof. Bahnhof is German for train station. It was a nickname that the prisoners had given this room, because the room was where you went to die. You were all going somewhere, and going somewhere soon. So my father tells a funny story of how he ends up in the Bahnhof, but there's nothing funny about being in the Bahnhof. This is one of those disconnects that I experienced for 40 years of listening to my father tell the story, and then I suddenly undisconnected when I was doing the research. I said, wait a minute. He could not have been in anything but a near-death condition to be put in the Bahnhof. And yet after a few days in the Bahnhof, they moved him to the regular infirmary, because somehow he convinced people there he wasn't going anywhere.
Mm.
Okay. That's one of the themes of your book, is your father's, use the word good fortune, lucky fortune, that somehow...
Or divine intervention, as some have said.
That you said you found... Well, okay. You said that you counted 6 times when he should have died.
Yes, well, in fact, the 6 came... I could actually probably count more, but the historians in the camp, who I worked with very closely, at one point in one of my trips there, after the trip that I described in the book, stopped me and said, your father was the recipient of 6 miracles. And they ticked them off. They had identified 6 times, 6 very discrete times he should have died and did not.
And this is a narrative that's in their head. It's like
in
it's
their
part
head.
of their,
Remember to go back to the 2007 experience of seeing his picture on the internet.
Yeah.
They had put his picture there because they found him and his experience to have been remarkable and unusual. They had somebody who not only survived the camp,
Wow.
but who had been hidden by a local family. So it was a feel-good story from them. And then it went from the feel-good story for them to this miraculous story as they got to know me and they got to learn more. They didn't know my father had escaped twice because the people who hid my father after his second escape, my father didn't say to them, this is my second time around. I messed up the first time. No, they only knew of one. When the concentration camp historians learned of two and all the other details that I gave them, they on their own had put together that he was the recipient of 6 miracles. There were no Jews involved. There are no Jews that I'm aware of in the group of historians who work in Mauthausen. But they're evangelical. They're very religious in their own right, and they feel my father was, God looked down on him and helped him survive.
The moments of him being saved, of these miracles. I urge our listeners to kind of take it up and read the book. I mean, you can read each one of them. It's unbelievable knowing the reality of this situation that he was in.
Sure.
Is there one in particular that jumps out that you say, how did he survive that?
I would certainly his first escape, and the multiple number of times. Well, actually, even his first death march leading to his first escape.
Why don't we, before we get to that, because maybe we can lead up to that, is about the death march. So, Beck, you had
All right, so as the U.S. Army approached KZ Mauthausen in Austria, the Nazis moved thousands of prisoners away from the battlefront on what had been called death marches. What was the purpose of moving all those people, and why not just kill them?
So, Mauthausen, as we've talked about, really was not a camp for Jews, but as the Americans were getting closer from the west and the Russians were getting closer from the east, the Germans recognized that they had to do something with the 40,000 Jews that were all caught in this pincer between the Russians and the Americans. It turned out there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 Jews, and they decided to march them all to Mauthausen, and they built a tent camp to house them. Once they had them all in Mauthausen, by the beginning of April 1945, so a month before the war ended, they started marching them to another camp called Gusen. Gusen was called a camp. What it really was an enclosure. It was nothing more than barbed wire and a few buildings. No sanitary facilities, no food facilities, nothing. And so between 750 to 1,000 Jews a day were marched out of Mauthausen and towards Gusen. My father was in one of the first marches. About 3 miles or 4 miles into the march, my father could not, and this is the answer to your question about what stands out more than anything else. So this is one march, not taking more than a few hours. He starts, it's downhill for about 2 miles. About 2 more miles later, and I don't know exactly where, it isn't like he said anything happened on the corner of 42nd Street and Broadway.
Right.
He just was describing things with time and element, and I pieced things together. He went to the side of the road. If you went to the side of the road, an SS trooper would shoot and kill you. But sometimes they'd give you a chance to get back up and get back on the march. My father went to the side of the road a few miles into this first march.
He'd had it.
He'd had it. He was toast.
And he knew he would die.
He knew he would die. And a trooper was walking towards him. They made eye contact, and the trooper holstered his pistol and kept going. Like, my father was incredulous. But that act gave him this burst of energy that got him back up. And he got back on the road, and 2 miles further on, I believe, because again, I'm guessing locations, but I know there was an intersection. And in that intersection, refugees were going north. My father's line of march was going west. They stopped my father's line of march directly behind him. The refugees, my father was the last guy in the intersection. The refugees didn't feel like waiting for this one emaciated Jew to get across the intersection, and they went. And suddenly my father's caught up with these refugees, and a light bulb goes off in my father's head. And he says, well, heck, if I just turn with them, maybe nobody will notice. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you only weigh 80 pounds. You're wearing a concentration camp uniform, and no one's going to notice. But he did it. He turned. He took 2 steps. He found a raincoat on the ground. He put it on. Yes, there's amazing. There's a miracle. Puts his raincoat on.
Because if he didn't find the raincoat.
If he doesn't find the raincoat, he's dead.
Yeah.
He finds the raincoat. I mean, I presume he's dead because
Yeah.
somebody is going to say,
Yeah, they're
what,
gonna
you're
notice.
not dressed like we are. Why are
Yeah.
you here?
Yeah.
Right? So he finds his raincoat. He goes about 100 yards, and then now this drifts into sort of what all the research was in the book. I didn't ask the question, but I now wondered, why did he go 100 yards before knocking? He knocked on a door. I always assumed the reason he didn't go 100 yards, he went 100 yards, is because it was fields. There was some big intersection. No, it's that there were the backs of buildings and no doors to knock on at that intersection.
Okay.
And I didn't know that until I went there.
Right.
But 100 yards up, the road narrows, and there are apartments or homes, typical European narrow, windy street, and there are homes. And he knocked on a door, and an old woman answered, and my father spoke fluent German. He spoke Yiddish, and therefore he spoke German, and it became fluent in his year in the camps. He knocked on a door, the old woman answers, and he says in fluent German, "I'm hungry, would you feed me?" And she invites him in, and she gives him cheese and noodles, and she allows him to wait in her backyard.
And this was heaven.
This was, yeah, exactly. And she allows him to wait in her backyard. Whether she noticed he was wearing a concentration camp uniform, unclear at the beginning. But eventually, she goes back to him. My father says 15, 20 minutes, a half hour, somewhere in there. She says, "You gotta go."
All right, can I make one point? Because there's
Absolutely.
one image that it just, I can feel it. He lies down on grass.
Exactly. Grass for the first time in a
Cool
year.
grass.
Meal for the first time in a year. Grass for the first time in a year.
Yeah.
The smell of grass and the kind of
Yeah.
that
if,
life
if,
that's
if
there.
you played ball, on a ball field when you were growing up, you know what that smell of grass is
Yeah.
like, or cut grass, from when the
And of course he'd want to stay
lawnmower.
there. It was like, it was just,
No question.
He was
And
in heaven.
She said, "You got to go." And my father's, he's 18 years old, 19 now. He's 19 years old, and he's like, "Okay, yeah, I'm going." But he didn't go. And 5 or 10 minutes later, she found 2 SS soldiers patrolling in the street outside, and she called them in.
young boys.
Young boys, younger than my father. And these guys turned out to be Hungarian SS. All the occupied countries could, if you felt like kowtowing to the Nazi dogma, then you could join the SS. And they did, and they were Hungarian. They didn't know my father was Hungarian because they debated in Hungarian what to do with him. They spoke to him in German. My father was responding in Yiddish. And they decided to take him to the local police station, which was only about a third of a mile away in the town square, which was a third of a mile away. And so you think of this from the time he left camp, the time he went to the side of the road, then the intersection and the raincoat and these Hungarian SS not killing him, and then he goes to the gendarmerie, essentially a local police station. He goes to the gendarmerie, and the gendarme inside says to my father, says to the SS guys, "You go, I've got the prisoner." Now, I didn't know, never asked, how did he get the authority to do this? It's because the gendarmerie worked for the same Heinrich Himmler who ran the SS.
Okay.
So they had essentially equal rank. So he outranked these kids. He tells them to go, and he asks my father in German, "Tell me how you got here." My father tells the story. He says to my father, "I'm going to let you sleep the night here in a jail cell. I'm going to feed you dinner, I'm going to feed you breakfast, and I'm going to get you back to the camp." So are there 6 miracles in this story alone?
Wow.
Probably.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
But did he think that when he was returned to the camp that they might kill him?
No question. And they took him back without a word. So
The way you describe it is like he walked into the camp and no one even noticed.
That's the way he describes it. And not only that, he goes back to his old barracks, and people are saying, "What are you doing back here? You were just on this on a march." They don't call them death marches; they only knew them to be transports. You were just
Right.
on a transport. What are you doing back here? My father told people what happened. He said half the people didn't believe him, so he stopped telling people what happened.
Wow.
I'm back.
Wow.
Yeah, and just say there, he was on a second death march.
He was on a second death march about 10 days later. We know the date of the second one. We don't know the exact date of the first one. And on the second one, same intersection, he had, energy to get there. It was about 6 miles from the camp, 7 miles from the camp. When there was no activity in that intersection, he was now really done. And about a mile or so later,
He was done before, now he's really done.
now he's really done. There are reserves of energy that we have that we just don't know. And then when we're done and we have no more reserves, we have more reserves. And
Wow.
he kept digging into reserves that he didn't know he had until finally, about a mile and change after that intersection, he was completely and totally done. And he went to the side of the road, and a trooper came over and put a pistol on the back of his neck. But it was late in the afternoon, around 6 o'clock at night. My father had a sense for timing that is savant-like, and accurate. Right? I mean, he didn't write any of this stuff down. He didn't have a watch. He figured about 6 o'clock it was drizzling and it was cold, and the pistol was cold. And the pistol in the back of my father's neck shocked him, and he stood up.
Wow.
And in the act
Ooh.
of standing up, the soldier decided not to shoot my dad because now he's up. And
Now he's
maybe
up.
Now he's up. And he walked away holstering his pistol. And my father looked behind him, and there were 2 more SS troopers, and they weren't looking at him. They were walking backwards, and there happened to be nobody in the march right where he was on his left, and on his right there was a path leading into bushes, and he just bolted down the path and threw himself into the bushes, and no one saw him do it.
Oh my gosh.
And you found that path.
We found the path. We found within, let's call it, inches of where he went to the side of the road, sat down, and had a pistol put in the back of his
It's
neck.
an amazing story. And it's an amazing story of, well, his will, obviously, but your will to actually spend the time and the effort and
get
the
all the
emotions to...
Well, it was an emotional journey, and the more emotional it became, the more determined I became to get to the point of where I knew all there was to know about what happened to him.
Right.
And then
you feel now that you know it.
I do. I mean, I still wish I could ask him the 1,000 questions and confirm a number of things, but there's no question we know the first intersection. There's no question we know the second intersection.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things we now know for sure that I know he experienced. I would love to stand there with him and say, Dad, so how'd you feel when you were bolting down this path? Or how did you feel when you turned into... I've been in the intersection where he turned.
Yeah.
I took... There's a photo in the book.
Dad, I did this. I investigated.
Yeah, I would have loved to have done it with him.
It sounds like he acted on instinct a lot.
No question, and an incredible instinct. Whether you call it lucky instinct or divine intervention or somewhere in between, yes, he operated on instinct. He became a businessman and an entrepreneur, and there's usually no rule book for that. And I think he got his training surviving that camp experience.
Wow.
We have to say something about the Friedmans.
Sure.
Because the Friedmans were the ones that discovered him. He pretended like he was dead.
Yes.
On the side of the road
yes.
after the second escape attempt.
Yeah.
But they actually saved him.
They saved his life. They saw my father lying by the side of the road. My father played dead. He didn't want anyone to discover him. He figured he would try to get into town on his own and sort things out. He had changed overnight into the clothes of a dead civilian on the side of the road.
Oh.
So they stood over my father 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, debating in German, which of course my father understood, whether or not he was alive. And they decided either he wasn't alive or for whatever reason, they decided to walk away. My father gets up and he decides he's going to go into town. All 80 pounds of him. He's wearing civilian clothes. Why not? Right? He speaks German.
Yeah, he had taken the clothes off of a dead prisoner.
A dead man on the side of the road. Yeah. There were many dead along the side of the road.
Dead civilian.
So if you were in civilian clothes, it's because you had been in a labor battalion that had been forced marched to Mauthausen in the weeks while they were building this 25,000 Jews capacity, and then they were put on the road to Gusen. So my father found one of these guys about his size, dead on the side of the road, changed into his clothes. My father was wearing civilian clothes. Anyway, after the Friedmans walk away, my father gets up and he walks down the path that he had bolted down. The path turns out to be a shortcut to the train station. Well, he turns around the bend. By the way, the path followed a river, a small stream, really, towards the train station. My father turns around a blind bend, and there's the couple walking right towards him. And the couple's grandchildren, the couple showed their grandchildren where this was, precisely where this was that they saw my father.
Wow.
And so, I know the grandchildren, and they don't speak a word of English, but I've gotten to know them, and we exchange cards, and I've hung them every time I see them, because
when you went back, it must have been like finding family you never had.
It is exactly like that. It is finding. It is.
And they found you.
It's finding. Well, family almost isn't quite enough. Without them, I'm not. Without their grandparents, I'm not here.
Right.
You know, when I went and I first saw their house for the first time, that was my house. This is the house I was born in, if you want to take it to that.
Yeah.
But so, when the Friedmans saw my father that morning, they had a little discussion, and my father said he was a Czechoslovakian escaped prisoner. And they told my father to go back to where they'd seen him playing dead, hide there. It was a hiding place. Hide there. Or I should say that it was a place where he could hide. He hid there through the day. They brought him some food in the morning. And that night they came with a horse and a carriage and took a cart and took my dad back to their house, which was only about a quarter mile away. And they hid him there for 3 weeks.
And it was they hid him there. I mean, there's more to the story.
There's
than
much
we're
more
gonna,
to the yes.
But they hid him there long enough for the Americans to finally break through.
Yes.
And get into Enns.
The Americans came in 3 weeks later, almost exactly 3 weeks later.
That also is just amazing. The timing is like.
Yes, it is. And as you know, in the book, I tracked that group. And in fact, the 65th Infantry Division is having their reunion in October in Dayton, Ohio. They've invited me. I'm going to be there.
Beautiful.
Wow.
Yeah. Beautiful. This is Patton's.
It's Patton's, part of Patton's Third Army.
Right.
The last division put together by the U.S. Army specifically for World War II, the 65th.
If our listeners want to learn more about this escape and how this all happened, we wanted to have you. We wanted you to read a piece of your book, and this is a section about which I found quite kind of it put a visual in my head of prisoners being marched, possibly a death march, but they're walking through cities, they're walking through towns.
They're towns, yes.
Next to houses, which people are living.
Yes.
And what are they seeing, these people that are living in these
They're
towns?
seeing people, in this case, what I'm about to read, they're seeing prisoners being marched from the Mauthausen train station to Mauthausen. Back to the question of the story that my father told. My father said when he arrived in Mauthausen, the first thing he did was take a shower. That's not true. The first thing he did was hike 3 miles uphill in a broiling June day after not having eaten for 4 days. The train station was 3 miles away, and they walked through town and then through the suburbs of town where there were houses along the road. And so people in these houses could see these prisoners being marched, these poorly fed or unfed prisoners, and probably in better condition at that point because it's early for them in their war experience. But they're looking at these people.
Right, as if we're here at Gephardt's. We're on the porch. There's glass all around us.
Yes.
What if we saw coming down 72nd, a bunch of prisoners
It's
being...
exactly like that.
What would we do? Read what... I mean, it's really beautifully written.
So I was in a car and I pulled over. So eyeing a home across the road from me, I say, I wonder what it would have been like to look out your living room window and see prisoners marching past on their way to or from Mauthausen. Perhaps the families of these houses were warned not to look, Angelica replies. Perhaps, I acknowledge, but I wonder even more what my father thought as he passed by. Did he make eye contact with anyone behind the windows? Or was he so consumed with merely trying to move forward that he wasn't thinking at all? Whether going uphill or down, my father was probably so wrapped up in the precariousness of his life as a Jew, caught in the teeth of the Nazi death machine, he may not have been thinking of anything except the next step, and the next, and the one after that. It would have been nice to be able to ask him now, ask him what he thought back then. Alas. We get back in our cars and drive on.
And your guide, Angelica, was very key because she had done a lot of work.
She had done
to help you find these
work.
places.
And it was sort of, we were both motivating each other. She, like I said earlier, that they didn't know when I first started where the Death March route was. Angelica wasn't in the picture at the time, but when she did get into the picture, they were beginning to form a sense as to what the Death March route was. And then I'm out there trying to get my father's history, and that really lit a fire under her. And she was the one, in fact, who found the two intersections. Again, my father didn't say he escaped at the corner of,
right,
Broadway and 72nd
Broadway and 72nd, yeah.
But based on his description,
right.
the 100 yards with no doors, Angelica said, oh, it could only be this place. And the second escape place with the bushes and trees, it turned out there were only two possibilities. Assuming you believed that he couldn't have walked more than a mile or two from the intersection that he had escaped from the first time. So if you triangulate all these data points, you end up knowing what my father experienced.
And the Friedman's grandchildren confirmed.
That must have just been so amazing. You've lived your whole life with Seder, right?
Yes.
And it's like your father, your whole life. And it's like now you're there.
It's going from a comic book to a color movie, color feature film. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
how much of what you've discovered has changed your life, and how has it changed your life?
That's a great question. It is not changed it dramatically because I've known the story my whole life. So there wasn't a question of discovering something unique about my dad, but recognizing just how horrific his story really was makes me honor him all that much more. understanding myself better. As you read the book, you understand that I now know why I do that litany of things, list of things. That
we talked about at the beginning.
Right. I know lots of people who do one or two. I don't know anybody who does quite the number that I do. And it's not because I'm a great athlete, because I'm not. I'm an okay athlete. But I do a lot of things, and I truly enjoy them. But it's coming from somewhere. And it's coming from that notion of trying to somehow equal. We all try to equal what our parents have done. So recognizing that I'm never going to equal what he's done, it takes the pressure off me, and I've palpably felt that. I think that experience that I had of recognizing I'm never going to be able to be quite as good, as incredible as my father was, makes me feel a lot better about getting up every morning and just being me.
Just being you.
Just being me.
Now you have permission to be you.
Exactly.
Since writing this book, you have spoken with young people from the Enns area, in which your father was a prisoner. What were the circumstances of these conversations, and how did the young people react to your father's story?
So the historians in the camp, along with other citizens who lived near the camp, there's a number of them, I'd say a total of 15 to 20, who have made it their lives' mission to get the word out as to what happened in Mauthausen. Remember, not just to Jews, but to non-Jews. What Mauthausen, how horrific it was, what it was really, Mauthausen and Gusen, because as you know, Gusen is now a housing community with a very small memorial and, of course, a working mill that might perhaps one day become a larger memorial. So when the book was published, these historians put together a week of me meeting with townspeople. One large meeting, I was introduced by the mayor. Enns was the town where he escaped, and Enns is the town where the Friedmans lived. Enns was 6 miles away from the camp, from Mauthausen camp. So he put together, the mayor put together a meeting, and these historians put together a half a dozen meetings with 200 to 300 high school kids at a time. And it was a really pretty remarkable experience, because these kids vaguely knew what had happened up the road or across the Danube, a few miles away from where they lived, but they didn't really have any way to put it into make it tangible, to touch it. And now I'm standing there and I'm showing them photographs of my dad when he's 12 and 14 and 17 years old, their age.
Their age, yeah.
Their age. And at one point I had the kids, any kid between 5'10" and 6 feet tall, stand up, and I'd say, okay, now picture yourself at half your body weight. Do you think that you could have done the things that I just described my dad did? And also, a lot of them had never met a Jew before.
Wow.
Which is or literally there were no Jews living in the area. There were apparently many hundreds of years ago, but not now. So many of the people many of the kids and adults that I met really had no relationships with Jews whatsoever. And so I was the representative Jew. And when you think about, if they learned the history of World War II, all they knew is what they would describe. They saw photos of Jews, probably incredibly emaciated, or if they've ever encountered recent stories and recent photographs, they're looking at an 80 and a 90-year-old. And so all of a sudden, they see me.
Right.
And they see photographs of my father when he's their age.
Mm-hmm.
And it puts it into context for them. And so, without exception, I had interested audiences. I had great questions. It was an eye-opener for me, and I think an eye-opener for them.
Wow.
Yes. Jack Hersch, this has been a roller coaster ride. There is so much more here. We've been talking with Jack Hersch, author of Death March Escape. It is a harrowing look into the depths of horror that can be created when we see the other as garbage. But more importantly, is about enormous strength, will to live, and how sometimes there can be an unbreakable love between a father and a son. By the way, I just want to mention that the incidental music that are being playing for this BCR episode is from Fred Laerdal's duo, performed by Rolf Schulte on violin and James Wynn on piano.
This is Bar Crawl Radio, and next up we will be talking with members of the Kings Bay Plowshares 7, who are facing decades in federal prison for their protest against U.S. nuclear weaponry.
And again, we want to thank Jack Hersch for joining us here at Gephardt's Beer Culture Bar on West 72nd Street, down the block, across the street from the mortuary.
Down the street from Trader Joe's and Papayas. And they're getting in their bar like wizards and mixologists, and they're making a drink for the fall, which we had a
here at
taste
Gephardt's,
of. Here at Gephardt's, a seasonal drink, and it's rye. It's a Manhattan
little
with
vermouth
rye,
and bourbon,
and a little bit of bitters and maple syrup.
And they serve it. It's called the Maple Manhattan. They serve it with a candied maple bacon.
Yes, it was actually delicious.
Doesn't sound kosher to me.
Sounds good though.
It sounds like dessert. No, we tasted it. He
Yeah.
made one for us. So Matt Gephardt was experiencing.
I may have to leave my straight Tito's on the rocks.
There you go.
All right. Well, that's you. Yeah, Tito's is great.
Yeah, that's what you should.
What a trip. What a trip. Read it, everybody. Death March Escape.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jack.